academic from Stanford University, Miram Sahami. He is an endowed professor, the James Eleanor Cheeseborough Professor in the School of Engineering at Stanford University, and simultaneously serves as professor and associate chair for education and the computer science department at that same institution. The professor joined the Stanford faculty after being at Google, where he was a senior research scientist. His research interests include computer science, ethics, and artificial intelligence, and intersection of those. And he has many distinctions, including serving on the California Governor's Advisory Board when it comes to computer strategic science and implementation. And this was under Governor Jerry Brown. So without any further ado, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining. What I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time talking about a book that we wrote and the contents which have to do with looking at the relationship of high-tech companies and where we've gotten to with some of the societal issues that we're confronting in technology. And part of that is wrapped into thinking about the pandemic and both the pros and cons we've seen of technology during that time. So what I'd like to do is share my screen with you. And then we will jump right into things. So hopefully you're seeing the screen share now. The book that I'm referring to is called System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. And this book was done jointly with my two co-authors, Rob Reich, who's a political philosopher, and Jeremy Weinstein, who's also a political scientist, but more from the social science side. And my background is in technology. And so what we wanted to do was come together to look at a number of issues in technology through multiple lenses. The lens of philosophy helps us understand the value trade-offs that are involved when we want to make particular decisions in technology. The technologist's point of view actually lets us know what the technology can do, what it's likely to do in the future, and also what it can't do. And the social science view allows us to look at the issues of policy in terms of what we might think of in terms of collective decision-making to get the kind of outcomes that we would actually like to see in technology, and then have those realized through regulation, for example. And so in the work, if you look back probably around 10, 15 years ago, there was a real notion of optimism in technology, that technology was going to solve a lot of our problems, that new advances would come along and help us address issues, both pragmatic issues, things having to do with climate, as well as, social issues in terms of connecting more people in the world. And what we saw, especially on display the last few years, is a real shift toward tech pessimism. People talking about things like privacy breaches and the impact on elections through misinformation that was being circulated through social networks. And what we found ourselves in was, swinging from one pole to another, sort of a utopian view that technology was going to help us solve all these problems, to a very dystopian view that just talked about the ills of technology. And what we wanted to do was take a real sober middle ground look to say there are real benefits that come from technology, but at the same time, there are dangers. And what can we do to mitigate those dangers while still enjoying the benefits that technology has to offer? If we were to consider what happened in the last year and a half through the COVID-19 pandemic, we can see that being on full display in the sense that many children were allowed to keep going to school because now they could go to school remotely as a result of technology allowing for things like video conferencing. That allowed work to continue for many workers as well, remotely from offices. There were things like social networks that allowed us to keep in touch with friends and family, even when we physically couldn't be with them. And so we saw that there's real tangible benefits. Even at the time when there was real tech pessimism, there are real tangible benefits to this technology. But at the same time, we continue to hear about issues around privacy. Just recently with Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, we've heard about a lot of the deleterious effects of social networks, for example, on teenage girls, among other populations, and that enough wasn't done to address or try to mitigate these issues. And so that's where we think about, okay, how can we still get the benefits that technology has to offer, but mitigate some of these harms that have come to light that it seems like some of the technology companies are not choosing to address as forcefully as they should. And so what we did was we created a course around these kinds of things. And through that course, we ultimately wrote a book together. And so what that book was about in terms of why did we write this book, what we were really looking to is to understand what are some of the negative social consequences in a deeper way, and understand that, oftentimes when people see these issues, they want to blame an individual or they want to blame a particular company. And in fact, what we wanted to analyze is there are systematic drivers for many of the things we see. It's not just about good people or bad people or good companies or bad companies. There are actually particular systems that are the drivers for these things. And we need to unpack and understand what those are if we want to address them. And then think about what are some real pragmatic ideas to be able to harness these benefits that we talked about while at the same time trying to mitigate the harms. So what does that look like? In terms of what the book's about, we start off with our diagnosis of the drivers of these problems. And it starts with something we refer to as the optimization mindset, which is the notion in technology that we want to optimize for solutions for problems. This comes from engineering and especially in computer science. And by itself, optimization may seem like a good thing. So you might wonder, why is trying to optimize something, a driver of potential problems? And the way to think about this is that optimization by itself is neither good or bad. Really, what optimization gives you is a way to drive some particular thing forward. But if the thing you're driving forward is actually a goal that has some negative qualities to it, what you're going to end up doing is amplifying those negative qualities. And so this mindset in engineering to want to optimize when the thing that you're optimizing isn't necessarily the thing that's best for society, and then you do that at a huge scale, you begin to see some of these problems. So let me give you an example to make it concrete. Facebook has the stated mission of connecting the world. Well, how do you measure connecting the world? How do you optimize that? Because as a concept, it's sort of amorphous. If you want to think about it from an engineering standpoint, what you do is you measure things like the amount of time people spend on a platform, the number of clicks they make on pieces of content, whether or not they engage with it, say they like it or they express some other emotion with it through the interface. Well, the issue with that is when you try to maximize that at scale, because that's what you're trying to optimize, you begin to see that just maximizing the amount of time people spend on the platform or having them click through on the most content doesn't necessarily mean you're connecting the world, because it turns out people are more likely, for example, to interact with inflammatory content. So you could actually be upsetting more people by driving these click-through measures, but it looks to you like you're doing a great job of actually getting people to interact with content, when in many cases that content could be upsetting to them or giving them misinformation that is sugar-coated to look even more attractive. And so if we think about a regulatory structure, the third ingredient that is one of these systematic drivers, or in some sense a lack of an ingredient, is there's a deliberate indifference, or there has been for about 25 years, by politicians around regulating technology. In some sense, a deliberate decision was made in the mid-1990s to create a regulatory oasis around technology companies to allow them to flourish. This was the early days of the World Wide Web, for example, and there was a real push by the administration at the time to see the web flower. And the commercial restrictions that existed at the time on the internet were repealed, and at the same time, we got the Communications Decency Act with Section 230, which is now hotly debated. But what it basically was, it said that platforms are not liable for the content on those platforms. They were basically treated like telephone companies. You don't find the telephone company liable for the speech that someone speaks on the telephone in the same way that means that Facebook and Google and others are not liable for the content that they display to users, because that content was generated by someone else and they're basically just the communications medium. So we got that regulatory oasis, which was great at the time. It allowed the internet to flower, but now 25 years later, we're seeing some of the negative impacts of that, and it's time to begin to rethink that regulatory regime. So when we think about some of the particular issues that we deal with, there's four main technological issues that we see either happening now or having great impact in the future. The first of which is algorithmic decision-making and notions of bias and fairness that come into that algorithmic decision-making process. So to make that a little bit more concrete, algorithms are now used to make significant decisions in many people's lives. Things like who gets access to credit, who gets a mortgage, who gets access to what kinds of healthcare, whether or not someone gets granted bail in the criminal justice system. These are all questions that more and more are now being driven by algorithms. Those algorithms make their decisions by finding patterns in data, a particular technique known as machine learning, which is part of a subset of artificial intelligence. And the idea is they take a bunch of data that's about historical, oftentimes human decision-making, find the patterns in it to be able to correlate a certain set of inputs, like things about, say, people's age and their credit worthiness by determining their credit worthiness by things like what their annual income are and where they live and other factors, to then make a decision, should this person be granted, say, a mortgage or not. Well, the problem is that many of those decisions may have exhibited human bias in the past, and that bias then gets encoded in the algorithm. And under the guise of appearing objective, because it's an algorithm, what we've actually done is encoded previous human bias. And now that bias is being executed at scale because the algorithm can operate much more quickly and on much more cases than a human decision maker could. So that brings up questions of what is fair? How do we detect this bias? What kinds of safeguards do we want to put in place to make sure we can mitigate some of the bias that might exist in existing algorithms? From there, we turn our attention to the notion of data privacy and the idea of data maximization, which is many platforms now gathering as much data as they can about their users and then using that data to make inferences. And the issue there is oftentimes what we're presented when we want to use a particular app is just a choice that says, do you want to use this app or not? And if you do, you are basically giving up most of your rights or all of your rights to the data that you're generating or anything that you upload to that application. And most people don't even bother to read those terms of service. You know, it's 20 pages of stuff, oftentimes a lot of legalese. People don't want to deal with it. So they just click OK, they give up their rights and they're using the app, not knowing what data is being gathered about them or how it's being used. And so the discussion we have in there is thinking about what are rights that we would want individuals to have over their data and examples that already exist. So the European Union, for example, is further ahead than the United States in this area through the General Data Protection Regulation. And part of the issue is in the United States, could we actually get something similar at a federal level? We already have a state policy in the California Consumer Protection Act. Something like that more federally would actually protect rights at a broader level. And so we get into some of those issues. From there, we turn our attention to automation and artificial intelligence, which clearly there's been a lot of discussion of. One of the main drivers we talk about in terms of AI is the impact that it will have on job displacement in the future and how that impact is likely to be unevenly distributed across different workers. And so if we want to deal with that issue, how do we consider it? I think we're getting a little bit of feedback. Great. How do we deal with that issue? So if we know that coming down the line, depending on who you talk to, the estimates right now say that between 9 and 47% of the workforce in the United States will be impacted as a result of automation. And that's in the 10-year time frame. So we're not talking 40, 50 years out, we're talking by 2030. We need to be able to prepare for that now so we don't get sharp increases in the unemployment rate. So what kinds of things can we do around education and reskilling to be able to better prepare for that eventuality of automation creating job disruption? And then we get into perhaps the issue people are most familiar with, free speech and democracy. And the notion that these days we have a superabundance of speech in online forums. And what that means is that speech can also include misinformation and disinformation that then is used to influence people's decision-making. We saw that on full display in the 2016 election, where it turned out that actually the information space could be polluted by bad actors who actually want to change the outcomes of elections. But at the same time, in the United States, we have this strong commitment to freedom of speech. So how do we navigate that issue to think about trying to control the speech environment from disinformation and misinformation while still protecting free speech rights? The other thing, and that I will show you a brief demonstration of, is how in situations like social networks, there's a tendency for the amplification of information to put people into their own, what's referred to as filter bubbles. People only see information from a particular slice of the world, oftentimes a slice of the world that reinforces their own belief system. So I'm going to share a different screen with you now. And what I want to actually show you is a little demonstration that we use with students in our class, which is a simple simulation of a social network. And in the simulation, we're going to have a certain number of users that are slightly what we refer to as left-leaning. They would be slightly more likely to read news stories from left-wing sites or the sites that lean a little bit to the left. And we have a group of slightly right-leaning users. Now, they're not that different than each other. These are not originally polarized groups. These are groups that are just slightly on one side and slightly on the other. And what we're going to do is we're going to control one knob, and that knob basically says, how likely is it that the piece of information we give you is randomly selected from among your friends versus being chosen as the piece of information that you're most likely to click on? So if we say we're more likely to sort of explore, in some sense, the information ecospace by showing you information from many of your friends, what we actually see in this network, the left-leaning users are in the blue, the right-leaning users are in the red, and the different colored lines between them are the strength of connection, how likely they are to share information. And after about 500 days, you see that this network is still very highly connected. People are very likely to share information between the left and the right. And what we generate in that network is this is the result of being able to actually have a high degree of getting information from any of your friends. But we can change this knob and say, you know, what I actually want to do is maximize the click-through rate or the likelihood that you will interact with a particular piece of information, because in the real world, that oftentimes means things like you're spending more time on the platform, there's more opportunities to show you advertising and hence generate more revenue for the platform. So if we run the same simulation, but now just focus on trying to show you information you're most likely to click on, here's what happens after 500 days. So this animation is kind of showing you over time the strength of the connection over various days. And you can see that basically when we get to the 500th day, there's virtually no crosstalk at all between our left-leaning users in blue and our right-leaning users in red. The network is basically broken in half. These two groups of people are now in their own information bubbles. They're basically living in some sense in alternate information realities. That is the polarization that we're seeing. And at the same time, it leads to more difficulty in terms of collective decision-making because people don't have a shared conception of what's going on in the world because the information they're getting is basically tribalized. So coming back to our slides, let me come back to share the original presentation with you. So there was the demonstration, and this echo chamber effect happens in the real world. So this is from some data from a paper about 6 years ago by Bakshi and others that analyzed actually 10 million real Facebook users. And what they looked at was when you show these users information, when that information is randomly selected over here, how much of that information is cross-cutting, which means it crosses political boundaries. And versus if you're just looking at selected information, most likely to be clicked on, the probability of cross-cutting information is much lower. And so this effect that I showed you in the simple demo that just had these 30 stylized users in it actually plays out to tens of millions of users in real spaces. It's just a lot easier to visualize in our smaller demonstration. And so what that leaves us with is the question of what do we do about it? Many times people think of technology as just this wave that's going to wash over us and there's nothing we can do. And our argument is it doesn't have to be that way. The way we think about it in the book is, there are many different levels that one can get involved in the process. At the most basic level, when someone's in a democracy and they are a citizen, they can vote. And that means their voice can be heard and their preferences basically put into a larger set of preferences that are adjudicated to come up with the societal policies we care about. Now, there's different people who are in different positions who will also have access to different levers of power. If someone's a technologist, they can have controls over or influence what are the things that are actually optimized in companies. Executives obviously can push the particular directions that companies move in. But at the end of the day, we're all citizens. We all can make our voice heard. We can try to talk to others to let them know about these issues. And that's part of where we try to get to is we need to change the regulatory structure if we want to deal with these systematic issues. And the way we kind of think about that is, what's the current choice we have? The current choice, the way it's structured is, do you use a particular app or not? Right. So the way we sort of see that decision presented to us by big companies is, well, if you don't like the application, just don't use it or just delete it. And the real question is that going to solve our problem? And the way we think about that is we liken it to, having very limited controls. Say if you were driving, well, if you were driving and someone told you your only choice is you can either drive or not drive, and if you drive, try to be safe. That's kind of like someone saying, well, there's these little things you can set in your applications, like your privacy settings, or you can use a different web browser if you don't want to be tracked or something like that. Those are micro decisions at individual levels. But in terms of driving, micro decisions by an individual don't create a system of safety. The way we create a system of safety and address systematic issues is we have actually regulation around driving. We have roadway systems, we have lanes, we have speed bumps around schools, we have stop signs and traffic lights. These are all things that create a system of safety for everyone. And within that system, you still have a choice whether or not you want to drive or not, and the individual choices you want to make for your personal safety. But we might get much greater collective safety through the regulatory structure of the roadway system. That's the same kind of safeguard we need in the technology sector. We need safeguards around things like basic privacy rights. We need to understand the impacts of automation and think about what kinds of policies for education and reskilling do we put in to not have so many shocks to the system for technological displacement from jobs as AI becomes more and more sophisticated. It doesn't say we need to hold the technology back. In some cases, there's debates about holding technology back. For example, say the use of lethal force by an automated system. That's something we might want to prohibit. But if we take as an assumption that technology will progress, and in many ways it can be beneficial, putting the guardrails in place to make sure that everyone can enjoy more of the benefits of that technology while mitigating the harms leads us to more of the societal outcomes we'd like to see. And ultimately, that means we need to have a democracy that's capable of governing technology. And that means both policymakers need to take the time to understand more about technology, and technologists need to take the time to get involved in the policymaking process. So the policies that we get to can actually reflect both the good and the bad of technology to mitigate those harms in an intelligent way, because we actually understand the technology at a deep level, while also understanding the complexities that come from making policy. So we only get to the places we want if everyone's involved and everyone makes their voice heard. And so that becomes the challenge for all of us. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I will stop there.
Wow.
I don't know if we have time for questions, but if there are, I'd be happy to take a few.
I actually have a question, Doctor. You mentioned that automation is going to displace many workers. Clearly, I live in New York City. The first thing I think about when I think about automation displacing workers is taxis and Ubers. Question, Doctor.
Referring to is called. Optimized in companies. Great questions. In terms of higher education, I do think there is
Question, Doctor. You mentioned that automation is going to displace many workers. Clearly, I live in New York City. The first thing I think about when I think about automation displacing workers is taxis and Ubers. At some point, I believe that there'll be automated cars, automated vehicles, driverless cars. You have a whole population. You're going to have a whole population of drivers who basically have nowhere to go. So they're going to need some kind of retraining. And I think this is a subject that hasn't really popped up in the last year or two. It's been out there for quite some time. I'm combining that at the same time with these reports that I've heard that there is a lot less motivation for young people coming out of high schools to attend university programs and get higher education, particularly among males. And unfortunately, America is still pretty much a male-dominated society where they are the breadwinners. So what do you see in terms of being able to remotivate or reinvigorate these types of programs so people will go on? Because clearly retraining programs are not going to be simple. These are technical fields that we're talking about. Automation and technology and programming all require higher levels of education. So what do you see as some possible solutions or directions to kind of ensure that younger people will then take higher education programs? And added to that, do you think this is just a kind of a cyclical thing where it goes one direction and then people stop going and then it goes back? Or do you think this is a permanent downward trend at the same time?
Yeah, those are great questions. In terms of higher education, I do think there is some cyclicality in the trend. I do think that, the pandemic and, being in higher education myself, we've definitely seen effects in terms of things like enrollment in higher education as a result of the pandemic. But I do think it's cyclical. I think that, these things shift over time. And part of it is also understanding what is the value proposition for higher education. So I think that institutions of higher education are also seeing the writing on the wall that in some senses the demand for what they have to offer is shifting. That causes them to shift in response as well. But at the same time, I think what we've also seen is that higher education is only one route for job reskilling or for job skilling in some sense for someone starting out, or reskilling if they want to go back to higher education. And that's the place where, getting the sort of support that we need and the funding behind education to also support alternative routes. So something that doesn't require a 4-year degree or even a 2-year degree, but are there programs we can build that allow someone in 6 months to get a very focused set of education to be able to make a transition from one existing job, say being a taxi cab driver, to some other job that still requires a particular level of skill, but may not require 4 years of training. Because that's also a difficult thing, realistically, to expect of someone who might already be well into their career to now say, you have to do years of school before you can switch to another field. And so that's the place I think we really need a lot of emphasis. I mean, higher education is great. I'm an advocate for that, but I do think we're going to need other kinds of programs that are much shorter in scale to get the kind of reskilling we actually need for a mid-career job force.
Just one quick follow-up. Are you optimistic that this retraining and this redirection is going to occur? Because as I indicated when I made my initial query, is that I've heard people talking about we need to retrain and redirect the force for years. Here in New York City, there is one commercial where we have an ongoing TV commercial where they're talking about, I used to drive a truck, or I used to do this, and now I'm moving into coding. Clearly, not everybody can go into coding because that field will become saturated. But are you worried that we're not moving quickly enough or moving with enough temerity to get these changes to occur?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think the changes are happening quickly enough. I mean, that's part of the reason for writing the book, is to try to bring more of these issues to light for action to be taken. But I very much agree with you. I think more needs to be done. It needs to be done more quickly. I do think we'll get there. So at some level, I'm optimistic of getting there. I'm not as optimistic about the time frame, and that's what I worry about: is how much unemployment, how much disruption are we going to see for what period of time, because we didn't address these issues early enough. But when we actually get to a point where we have like large scale automation for the transportation industry, that about 9% right now of the US, of the entire US labor force is involved in, that has huge potential to increase the unemployment rate. And can we just, can we move the reskilling along faster so that we don't see this huge bump in the unemployment rate? And that's the only time at which lawmakers actually take some action. I think that would be tragic to see, but I do think it's possible. So we need to move more quickly.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Professor Sahami, this is Dr. Elko. I really thank you for that insightful presentation. And
thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. So we actually been expecting you. I'm sure some people who left will regret this. So one issue I took about three issues that I was able to pick up from your presentation. One of them is this, where you said that the effects of technology are ours to shape. So I get that, but I do not think that, yeah, maybe people who are policymakers can influence that, but ordinary folks that consume the social media and all that are vulnerable. They are not able to really bring about change. I tell you, I'm sure you must be familiar with a book called The Cost of Connection. Yeah, actually, I used to mention that particular book to some of my students in terms of how I explained to them how they're also making people rich without what they call digital colonialism, right? So, before the colonial experience, people were forced to come and become slaves, right? But today, we have become slaves to all these tech giants without our knowing it. We are making money for them and they are not paying us, right? A lot of people don't know that until you draw that attention. So, and they have become so much addicted to all these social media. I saw the clip you have there, the slide where somebody says, "What should we delete Facebook and stuff like that?" So I want to expand more on this. How do you think the effects of technology are truly ours? When I talk about our society, all of us, both the educated and uneducated, and a lot of people who are not even familiar with how they're being exploited and all that. So to what extent can ordinary folks control or shape the situation to a level that they are no longer vulnerable or exploited?
Good question, and it's a long process, and I think that's the challenge. Is there aren't simple solutions that are easy to enact, but what they require is the people be involved and they express, in terms of the people they vote for, the ways that they talk to their elected representatives, because there actually, I do think, is a regulatory window that is opening now. We've seen in the past couple of weeks, more hearings in Congress, especially with Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower. And I think Congress has gotten themselves into a situation because they've shined such a bright light on having these hearings and bringing her in for testimony, that they will look foolish if they do nothing. Now, there is a world in which they will look foolish and do nothing, right? I don't rule that out. I think there's a chance that happens. But I think the fact that if you look now at what's happening in Congress versus, say, 2 years ago when we had Orrin Hatch, who didn't even know how Facebook made money, right? And it was laughable. We have much greater understanding in Congress, and especially among the staffers of those Congress people who are much more tech savvy. The question is, how do we get the outcomes we really care about? Like some of the issues you're talking about have to do with, for example, having sensible privacy policy that gives people more control over their own data and sets the default settings for how data is gathered to be much more stringent, that far less data by default is gathered by people as they interact online. Those are things that can be regulated. In terms of the European Union, we've actually seen a template for that in GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. But in the United States, we have a very different framework that's called notice and choice, which is you are notified of what information is going to be gathered from you in those huge terms of service, and then you make a choice to say yes or no, basically. And our view is that framework is too anemic. It doesn't actually address the problems in a meaningful way. And as a result, people don't really understand what data is being gathered from them and how it's being used. But to get the policy outcomes that really put power back in the hands of people, people need to exercise their power to say, well, we're actually in control of the electoral process. That's a long game, but that's the biggest lever I see to actually get there, which is why people need to get involved, get informed, and take these issues seriously.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do we have any other comments? But again, maybe what he just spoke, the thing he said about Congress' willingness to address this issue, because as divided as we are today, it seems to me like there seems to be some kind of unanimity in dealing with this issue between Republicans and Democrats. That's what I can sense. I may be wrong, but that's what I sense in Congress. And he said that building a democracy capable of governing technology. So, how does that happen? Is it by making it a central issue in electoral debates or something? Well, even if it happens in the United States, how about other emerging countries? How some of them are even just, you mentioned Oran Hatch, for example. Some of these other people don't even know a lot of things about how this technology works. So how a lot of people may not even know the connection between government, governing or governance and technology, right? So how do we honestly build a democratic architecture that will be able to govern technology to the extent that people are not exploited to the advantage of society? Because technology is good, no doubt, but sometimes these things can be abused, all right? So how do we build that architecture that should be able to ensure that people are in control of technology rather than the other way around?
That's a great point. And as a matter of fact, we used to have more of that. So back in the 1980s and 1990s, there was an office in Washington, D.C. called the Office of Technology Assessment. And what it was set up was to basically be a nonpartisan group to inform, but it was funded by the government to inform policymakers about the effects of technology. And what happened was in the mid-1990s, through the Contract for America, that office was disbanded because the idea was that the policymakers should be getting their information directly from the source, the technology companies. And what that did was it opened up Washington, D.C. to a huge amount of lobbying by the tech sector, because now the members of Congress were being informed about technology by the very people they were trying to regulate, right? And so you can see that the dysfunction in that dynamic. But we actually had that Office of Technology Assessment for 20 years. There's no reason why we couldn't reconstitute an office like that and say what we actually need is more expertise, technological expertise, informing policymakers so we get good policy. So there's examples of this in the past that we point to and say, some of the things we want to do are not kind of, blue sky, wishful thinking. We've actually been in a better place before, and it's possible for us to get back to that better place. It just requires a will to actually do it. And so I think that's what makes me hopeful, is there's actually examples of this in the past, and I think we can get back there again. And it's more likely that we will now that, as you mentioned as well, both the left and the right in Congress shows more willingness to do something about this issue. The place that we get into the entanglements are, when they begin to discuss issues of free speech, they have very different notions of how speech should be regulated online. But I think that's one of the issues that comes further down the road. In the meantime, there's certainly privacy policy we could get that there would be bipartisan support for. And if there's the greater awareness, as Robert was referring to, of what's going on in the labor force, I think we can actually get some useful policy around educational support that there's actually support for the left and the right for, because the left generally is in favor of education policy. And on the right, many of their constituents are the ones most likely to be impacted by automation. So they have a vested interest in those policies as well. And as we get more of those policies in place to govern technology, what it actually shows is that our democracy is capable of doing that and begins to move us to be able to tackle some of the thornier issues that have to do with free speech and the moderation of content and misinformation and disinformation and on the internet. I think that's probably the most difficult issue to deal with. But if we can take the smaller steps of regulating other forms of technology before we get there, we will build out that capability to be able to really assess technology better.
A very quick one. Sorry, I hope I'm not taking so much time. Before you came in, we had this conversation about misinformation and disinformation. Could we get your thoughts on the distinction between the two?
Sure. The way I think about them is the difference is really around intent. Misinformation is information that is, generally not correct or has a particular slant to it, but may have been generated not with the express purpose to mislead, but because the people who generated it did not actually have the right information. Disinformation has the intent behind it to try to mislead. It's actually generated with that express purpose. And so for example, in a lot of the political influence we saw in the 2016 election, especially influence that was coming from overseas, that was disinformation, right? It was actually generated specifically to sway the electorate in a particular direction.
Thank you so much. I don't know whether there is any other comments or questions from anyone.
I think Mike Wagenham waiting. And he's already overdue.
Okay, so I'd like to thank Professor Sahami very profusely. It was difficult to reach him, and he has so much on his table, and he managed to squeeze out some time for us. I really, really appreciate this, and I'll convey the message to the CMPI team, and of course, Rodgers. The dean of the faculty of SPA has just left because he's attending the president's meeting. So, but I just called my wife. It just as you are coming in that he left. So, but I'm sure I'll convey the good wishes, to him and tell him that you were able to come in and make a very good presentation. When we do the report, I'm going to share it along with everyone, including yourself. Thank you so much, Professor Sahami, and my regards to California.
Thank you.
Now, George, can you introduce the next speaker, Mike, please?
Thank you.